Why did you keep your daughter in a room?
Mr. Wily has no comment.
No comment.
We haven't had time to discuss the charges. We haven't even seen them.
Unable to face the truth, Clark took matters into his own hands.
Wild and isolated children. Genie Wily, the feral child. There have been a number of cases of feral children rise in social isolation with little or no human contact. Few have captured public and scientific attention like that of a young girl called Genie. She spent almost her entire childhood locked in a bathroom, isolated and abused for over a decade. Genie Wily, born April 1957, was a severely neglected and abused child who was discovered and taken into custody by authorities when she was 13 years old. While her circumstances until the point were undeniably tragic, they also presented an opportunity for psychologists, linguists, and other researchers to study psychosocial, emotional, and cognitive development in an individual who had suffered from several social isolation and deprivation. In particular, the discovery of Genie presented an opportunity to study whether a child who was past the so-called critical period for language acquisition could learn to speak a first language. The case of Genie Wily came to light on November 4, 1970. Genie was discovered by a social worker when her mother, who was partially blind, went to apply for social service. Genie had been isolated in a small room starting at the age of 20 months until her discovery at 13 years and 9 months old. She spent most of her time naked and tied to a potty chair, where she was given limited use of her hands and feet. She was completely cut off from any kind of stimulation. The windows were curtained and the door was kept closed. She was only fed cereal and baby food and wasn't spoken to. The National Institute of Mental Health provided funding for research and a team was assembled whose goal was to rehabilitate and study Genie's progress. Her rehabilitation team also included graduate student Susan Curtis and psychologist James Kahn. Upon her initial arrival at USLA, Genie weighed just 59 pounds and moved with a strange bunny walk. She often spat and was unable to straighten her arms and legs. Silent, incontinent, and unable to chew, she initially seemed only able to recognize her name and the word sorry. After assessing Genie's emotional and cognitive abilities, can describe her as the most profoundly damaged child I've ever seen. Genie's life is a wasteland. Her silence and inability to use language made it difficult to assess her mental abilities. But on tests, she scored at about the level of 1 year old. Genie soon learned basic social skills like using toilet and dressing herself. She was fascinated by her environment and would study it intensely. She especially enjoyed visiting places outside the hospital. She was talented at nonverbal communication, but her ability to use language didn't proceed rapidly. As a result, psychologist David Rigler decided to focus the research on Genie's language acquisition. Part of the reason why Genie's case fascinated psychologists and linguists so deeply was that it presented a unique opportunity to study a hotly contested debate about language development. Essentially, it boils down to the age-old nature versus nurture debate. Does it genetics or environment play a greater role in developing language? Within the first 7 months after her discovery, Genie learned many new words. She had even begun to speak but only in single words. By July 1971, Genie could put the words together, and by November she could put together 3. Despite signs of progress, Genie never learned to ask questions, and she didn't seem to understand the rules of grammar. Unfortunately, this never happened for Genie. Her language abilities remained stuck at this stage, and she appeared unable to apply grammatical rules and use language in a meaningful way. At this point, her progress leveled off, and her acquisition of new language halted. National Institute of Mental Health withdrew funding in 1974 due to the lack of scientific findings. Linguist Susan Curtis had found that while Genie could use words, she could not produce grammar. She could not arrange this word in a meaningful way, supporting the idea of a critical period in language development. Historian and psychologist Harlan Lane points out that there's an ethical dilemma in this kind of research. If you want to do rigorous science, the Genie's interests are going to come second some of the time. If you only care about helping Genie, then you wouldn't do a lot of the scientific research. So what are you going to do? Genie is believed to be alive and living in adult foster home as a ward of the state of California. While the linguist who worked with Genie, Susan Curtis, has attempted to get in touch with her, she's been repeatedly rebuffed. However, she said that when she calls the authorities, they inform her that Genie is well. Yet, when journalist Rosa Reimer saw Genie at her 27th birthday party, he painted a much blacker picture. Similarly, psychiatrist Jay Shirley, who was at Genie's 27th and 29th birthday, claimed Genie was depressed and had withdrawn into herself. So, why did Genie not progress more than she did? By the time the scientists finished working with Genie, she had not fully mastered English grammar, and her rate of acquisition had significantly slowed down. Linguists ultimately conclude that because Genie had not learned a first language before the critical period had ended, she was unable to fully acquire a language. Furthermore, despite the clear improvements in her conversational competency, it remained very low, and her vocalization remained highly atypical. While she has expanded her use of language to serve a wider range of functions, she had an unusually difficult time utilizing it during social interactions. Tests on Genie's brain found she was acquiring language in the right hemisphere of her brain despite being right-handed, giving rise to many new hypotheses and refining existing hypotheses on cerebral lateralization and its effect on linguistic development.